The telegraph key beneath Ruth Erdmann's fingers began to chatter at 4:30 on a Thursday in late September 1868. And the rhythm was wrong. 4 years of operating the key had taught Ruth to recognize senders by their cadence. This one was frantic, desperate, the dots and dashes coming in bursts like a man trying to speak while running. Cache secure, stop, Erdmann, compliant, stop. Pike arrives with keys, stop, move, strongbox, before equinox, stop. The pencil slipped from Ruth's fingers. She stared at the message, her pulse hammering in her throat. Erdmann, Klaus. Her husband's name in a coded telegram meant for criminals. She copied the message into her hidden ledger with shaking hands, then fed the original into the potbelly stove. The paper curled and blackened, and Ruth watched it burn while her mind raced. Pike, she knew that name. Avery Pike, wanted for stealing Army payroll 2 years ago. The same time the Army burned the Lakota camp in the breaks, Ruth locked the office and walked straight to Eliza Boone's schoolhouse. The older woman took one look at Ruth's face and pulled her inside. "Trouble," Eliza said. Not a question. Ruth handed her the copied telegram. Eliza read it twice, her expression darkening. "Pike. Nathaniel told me about him. Once stole payroll, disappeared before the Army could hang him. That was right when the Lakota camp burned." "I think they're connected," Ruth said. "I need to know what Klaus is involved in." "Then find out," Eliza said. "But be careful. Men like Vance don't forgive questions." Ruth went home. Klaus's house was empty, his horse gone. She stood in the doorway of his room, heart hammering, then crossed to his desk. Survey maps lay beneath a river stone. Ruth's hands trembled as she spread them out. The breaks, parcels marked in blue ink, and in Klaus's precise handwriting, White Elk Grant, household plots on agency rolls, Treaty Fort Laramie Art, Sex, original boundary maps and agency rolls secured from Pike Raid Site 1866, hidden for leverage. Ruth stared at the words until they blurred. Klaus had been at the raid. Klaus had taken something. Original boundary maps and agency rolls, treaty documents proving land ownership. Hidden for leverage against Pike. Hoofbeats outside. Ruth replaced everything exactly as she'd found it and slipped out. Klaus entered through the kitchen looking 10 years older than his 45 years. "Evening," he said without meeting her eyes. "Will you be home for supper?" "No, patrol." Something flickered across his face. Guilt, fear. "Don't wait up." He left. Ruth changed into her irregular riding skirt with the hem tied up over bloomer-style underpants and saddled her mare. She was going to follow him, going to find out what Klaus Erdmann was hiding, even if it meant riding straight into darkness. The mare's hooves kicked up dust as Ruth tracked Klaus east along the dry riverbed. His bay had a chipped left rear shoe, distinctive, easy to follow. The sky was turning copper-colored storm clouds, building like mountains on the horizon. The mare tossed her head nervously, ears flicking. Then the dust storm hit. It came from the west like the world ending a churning wall that turned air solid. The mare screamed and reared. Ruth grabbed for the reins, but they burned through her fingers. She hit the ground hard, breath gone, and by the time she could breathe again, the mare was gone and the storm was everywhere. Ruth ran blindly. Dust filled her mouth and nose thick as wool. Each breath was agony. Her skirt tore on yucca spines. Sharp stones cut through her boots. The world had become howling nightmare, and Ruth knew she was dying. Something buzzed beneath her foot, dry, rattling deadly. Ruth threw herself sideways as the rattlesnake struck fangs, flashing past her ankle close enough to feel heat. She scrambled away on hands and knees, skin scraping from her palms, and when she tried to stand, her legs buckled. She collapsed against a juniper tree, vision narrowing. She pressed her handkerchief over her mouth, but breathing through it was like breathing through mud. Darkness closed in. Then strong hands gripped her shoulders. She was lifted over a broad shoulder and carried at a run. Gunfire cracked through the howling wind, 2 sharp reports close. Whoever carried her didn't slow, just kept running with ground-eating strides. A door crashed open. Ruth was set down, and a wool blanket wrapped around her pulled over her head. Then she was lifted again, cradled against someone's chest, and a hand cupped the back of her head with surprising gentleness. Through the wool she heard a heartbeat, steady calm. Her body relaxed without permission. Her breathing slowed, matching that heartbeat. She smelled wood smoke and sage and rain on hot stone. The storm's roar faded. Ruth slept. Dawn light woke her. Ruth lay on a dirt floor wrapped in the blanket, every muscle screaming. She sat up slowly and looked around. Small cabin, half ruined. Broken furniture scattered. Morning light through gaps in log walls. And beside her, back against the wall, sat the man who'd saved her. Maddo, tall, broad-shouldered, maybe 35. Black hair in a single braid. Left eye clouded white from old injury, right eye dark as obsidian. Buckskin trousers, mended cotton shirt, bone-handled knife at his belt. His good eye opened and fixed on her face. "You're awake." Ruth's voice came out ragged. "You saved me." "Yes." "Why?" "Because you needed saving." He reached for a leather canteen and held it out. "Drink." Slowly. Ruth drank. The water was warm, tasted of leather, but it was beautiful. "I heard gunshots. Someone was shooting at us. At the cabin." He pulled 3 spent paper shells with brass bases from his belt. "Fresh. Someone wanted us dead." Before Ruth could respond, horses thundered outside and the door burst open. 4 men on horseback silhouetted against sunrise. Silas Vance sat at front, lean and silver-haired, smile like a knife. Well, well. The sheriff's little wife spending the night with the one-eyed savage. That'll make for interesting conversation. Ruth scrambled up, face burning. Another horse approached, and Klaus's voice cut through the morning like a whip. "Step away from my wife." Klaus dismounted and strode forward, hand on his Colt Navy Model 36 caliber worn walnut grip. His face was white with fury. "Klaus," Ruth began. "Quiet." Klaus stared at Maddo with naked rage. "I said step away." Maddo rose, positioning himself between Ruth and the doorway. Didn't reach for his knife, just stood, and that made him more dangerous. "She was dying in the storm," Maddo said calmly. "I brought her here, that's all." "That's all?" Vance's voice dripped false concern. "Your wife spends the night with a savage. Folks'll have opinions." Klaus's hand tightened on his revolver. "Vance, leave. Now." Vance gestured at the cabin wall where fresh buckshot marks scarred the logs. Someone already expressed their opinion. Ruth pulled the telegram from her pocket with shaking hands. "This is why I followed you." Klaus's gaze snapped to the telegram, and something like fear crossed his face. Vance's smile vanished. "Where did you get that?" "Public telegraph. Misdirected." Ruth's voice steadied with anger. "You were careless." Klaus took the telegram hands, trembling, read it, looked at Ruth with anguish. "You followed me. You could have died." "I almost did." Klaus studied her face, then looked at Vance with something dark and final. "We're done, Vance. All of us. No more." "We're done when I say we're done," Vance snapped. "You've got until sundown to get your house in order. Pike arrives tonight. Have the keys ready or—" He looked at Ruth, eyes winter cold. "Or accidents happen. Storms, Snakes Falls." He wheeled his horse and rode off. Klaus stood holding the telegram like a death warrant. "Klaus," Ruth said quietly, "tell me what's happening." He looked at her, and for one moment she saw past the coldness to exhaustion and fear beneath. Then his expression hardened. Go home, Ruth. Stay there. Don't talk to anyone and stay away from this. He turned to Maddo. You. Gone by sundown or I arrest you. This is my land, Maddo said. My brother's land. Not anymore. It's been sold. Klaus walked to his horse. Ruth, come on. Ruth hesitated, looking at Maddo. Their eyes met. Go, Maddo said softly. Be safe. Klaus boosted Ruth onto his horse and mounted behind her arm, tight around her waist. They rode back in silence. Behind them, Maddo watched them disappear, then turned and walked into the breaks. Someone was stealing his home. Last night, someone had tried to kill the woman who might help him prove it. She'd come back, he was certain, and he'd be ready. Red Mesa looked different after the storm, everything filmed with copper dust. Klaus rode through town, ignoring stares. At the house, he lifted Ruth down without a word and walked inside. Ruth followed him to his room. He was rolling the survey maps with sharp, angry movements. Klaus, talk to me. There's nothing to talk about. That telegram says otherwise. Erdmann compliant. What does that mean? Klaus's hands stilled. For a long moment he didn't breathe. Then he turned expression bleak, hollowed out like a house gutted by fire. It means I made a terrible mistake 5 years ago that's been following me ever since. It means Vance has information that could see me hanged for treason. And it means you need to stay out of this before you get killed. Ruth's breath caught. Treason. Klaus set the maps down carefully. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible. I deserted. December 1863, after Chattanooga. Lieutenant Klaus Erdmann, 4th Artillery Union Army. I'd spent 2 years calculating trajectories and watching men die because of my calculations. They gave me commendations. And all I could think about was how many men I'd killed. He paused, hands clenching. I planned to steal artillery designs, sell them start over. But when I broke into the command tent, I found land boundary maps and agency rolls. Original treaty documents from Fort Laramie, 40-acre parcels for Lakota families. And evidence that Lieutenant Avery Pike was planning to steal them during a raid on the breaks. Ruth's heart hammered. You took the boundary maps and agency rolls. I took them. Thought if I had them I could stop Pike, expose him, do one good thing. But I was a fool. Pike had already set the raid in motion. I got there too late. 4 people died in the fire, including a child, Maddo's nephew, 8 years old. His voice cracked. I tried to save them. Pulled 2 people from the flames. Too late. By the time the soldiers left, I had blood on my hands and a satchel full of boundary maps and agency rolls I didn't know what to do with. So you hid them, Ruth said. In the old silver mine. Strongbox. Thought maybe someday I could return them. Then Vance found me 2 years ago. Tracked me through Army records, found the desertion warrant. Made me an offer where the badge looked the other way and my past stays buried. If I refused, I'd hang. Klaus's shoulders sagged. I thought I could control it. But Pike showed up 6 months ago with that stolen payroll. Vance saw opportunity to make real money. They forced me to help create forgeries of the boundary maps and agency rolls I'd hidden sell the land. When I refused, Vance reminded me he knew where I'd hidden the originals. That he could take them any time, and I'd have nothing, no leverage, no proof. Ruth stared at her husband, seeing him clearly for the first time. Not cold and distant, but broken under the weight of good intentions gone catastrophically wrong. Tonight, Pike arrives with keys to the strongbox. They're moving it to the buyer at the trestle. Once the sale goes through, Vance will kill me because I'm a witness. He crossed to his trunk, pulled out a Derringer and flask. Pressed them into Ruth's hands. Derringers loaded 2 shots, .41 caliber. Flask has water for 2 days. When something happens to me tonight, you ride to Prescott. Find the marshal. Tell him everything. Ruth looked at the gun, then Klaus. I'm not leaving you. Yes, you are. No. Ruth closed her fingers around the derringer. You tried to do the right thing. You failed, but you tried. And now you're trying again. That means I'm not abandoning you. Klaus's expression cracked naked gratitude beneath. Then he turned away, shoulders rigid. Do what you want, but don't say I didn't warn you. He walked out and rode toward town, without looking back. Ruth stood holding the derringer and flask, thinking about the girl she'd been 6 months ago, desperate, frightened, willing to marry a stranger to escape her father's debts. That girl would have ridden for Prescott. Ruth wasn't that girl anymore. She tucked the derringer in her boot, the flask in her pocket, and walked to the telegraph office. Eliza was waiting, arms crossed, worry carved into her face. Everyone's talking. Vance is spreading stories. Half the town thinks you're ruined. I don't care, Ruth said. Klaus told me everything. Vance and Pike are moving stolen land boundary maps and agency rolls tonight, original treaty documents. They're selling them at the trestle. We have to stop them. Eliza's eyes widened. Klaus took the boundary maps and agency rolls to stop Pike. It's complicated. We need Dr. Whitlow. He treated raid survivors. He might know something. Eliza hesitated, old hurt flickering. Then nodded. I'll get him. She returned with Nathaniel Whitlow. Thin, gray-haired, moving with careful precision. He read the telegram Ruth showed him and went pale. If they're moving original treaty documents, this is worse than fraud. It's war against the Lakota people. Can you help us? Ruth asked. Whitlow nodded slowly. The strong box is in the old silver mine. One of the survivors told me he'd seen soldiers loading something heavy into upper tunnels during the raid. There's a ventilation shaft on the north side, narrow, but we could fit. Ruth's pulse quickened. Then we go tonight. Get proof and stop them before they make the sale. That's suicide, Whitlow said. They have men guns. We have the truth, Ruth interrupted. And we have Maddow. He knows those tunnels better than anyone. You're going back to him. I'm asking him to help us finish what Klaus started. Ruth found Maddow at the ruined cabin as dusk fell, sharpening his knife. He looked up as she approached. Your husband told you to stay away from me. He did. I'm not good at following orders I don't agree with. Maddow's mouth twitched. I noticed. Ruth pulled out the telegram and Whitlow's map. I know where the strongbox is, when they're moving it, why the army burned your brother's camp. Maddow's knife stilled. Why? To steal land boundary maps and agency rolls. Treaty grants proving your brother owned 40 acres. Klaus witnessed Pike planning the raid, stole the originals to stop him. Too late to prevent the attack. He's been hiding them since. Now Vance is using them, and Klaus's desertion to control him. Ruth took a breath. I'm getting those boundary maps and agency rolls back tonight. I need your help. Maddow studied her face. Why are you doing this? Because it's right. Because I'm tired of being afraid. And because... She hesitated. Because you saved my life, and some debts can only be paid by standing together when it matters. Maddow's expression softened. All right, I'll help. But when this is over, if we're still alive, you're going to tell me the real reason. The real reason. The one you're not saying. His good eye held hers. The one that has nothing to do with debts. Ruth's cheeks burned, but she didn't look away. If we're still alive, then let's make sure we are. They reached the silver mine after full dark. Boarded entrance, rusted chain warning danger. Flooded, no entry. Matto led them to the ventilation shaft, black mouth in the earth grate pushed aside. He tied rope to a juniper root and descended. Ruth followed, gripping so tight her hands went numb. Whitlow came last. The shaft was endless cold and damp, smelling of wet stone. Ruth's boots slipped. Once she nearly fell but forced herself down. Her feet hit ground, and Matto's hand steadied her elbow. They were in a tunnel barely tall enough to stand timbers groaning. Ahead, lamplight flickered. Voices echoed. Before dawn. Erdmann has the keys. You brought mules. 3 strong ones. This strong box is heavy. Good. Pike wants it at the trestle by first light. Then we're done with that fool sheriff. Vance's voice smug and satisfied. Ruth's hands clenched, but Matto's hand on her arm stopped her. Slow, he breathed. We see before we act. They crept forward. The gallery ahead was enormous, 50 feet across ceiling, lost in shadow. Center strongbox on handcart, iron-banded and heavy. Around it, Vance, sharp-faced Pike, with a scar, 2 others in 2 clean army uniforms, and Klaus. Klaus stood apart, arms crossed, face haggard. He looked like a man who'd stopped sleeping weeks ago. The keys, Vance demanded. Klaus tossed a key ring to Pike. That's all of them. Now give me what you promised. Soon as we're across the trestle and the buyer pays. Vance said, smiling. What's the rush, afraid your wife's going to figure things out too late? She knows too much. Pity. Klaus's hand went to his revolver. You leave her alone. Oh, I will. Quick accident. Vance's smile widened. Tragic. Before Klaus could move, a bell rang in the distance, 3 long, urgent peals echoing through the tunnels. Eliza's signal. Something wrong. Pike barked orders. Someone's onto us. Move, now. Vance grabbed a lantern. Get the mules. Back route. Klaus started toward the tunnel. If someone hurt Ruth, then live with it, Vance snapped. He pressed his revolver against Klaus's ribs. You stay until this is done. Ruth couldn't wait. She pulled the derringer and stepped into lamplight. Nobody move. Every head turned. Vance's expression shifted from surprise to fury to cold amusement. Mrs. Erdmann, you should have stayed home. I'm not going home. Ruth's hand was steady despite her hammering heart. That strongbox is full of stolen treaty documents. I'm taking them back. Vance laughed. You and what army? Her and us, Matto said, stepping from shadows, knife in hand. Whitlow emerged, rifle raised. Put your guns down. For a frozen moment, no one moved. Then rushing water filled the gallery, growing louder. Matto's head snapped toward the sound alarm, crossing his face. The lower tunnels, flooding. Move. Klaus shoved Vance and lunged toward Ruth. Everyone out, now. Too late. Water hit like a living creature, a churning black wall sweeping away lamps and tools. Ruth screamed as current grabbed her legs and pulled. She went under, lost in cold and darkness and certainty of drowning. Hands grabbed her strong and sure hauled her upward. She broke surface, gasping, and Matto's arm locked around her waist. Hold on, he said. They fought the current toward higher ground. Ruth clung to him, fingers digging into his shirt. Behind them, shouts, handcart overturning strongbox, spilling into flood. They reached a side tunnel, narrow opening above waterline. Matto boosted Ruth up. She scrambled onto the ledge, coughing water. Whitlow was there, blood from a forehead cut. Matto pulled himself up last. Below, water had risen chest high. Vance clung to a timber, screaming orders. No one followed. One of his men had disappeared. The other struggled toward the strongbox, wedged against rocks. Klaus was in the water, fighting toward them, eyes locked on Ruth. Halfway there, Vance grabbed him, pulling back. Keys. Where are the other keys? Klaus drove his elbow into Vance's gut. Vance lost his grip, and Klaus surged forward. Almost made it. Then Pike appeared at the tunnel entrance behind Ruth, rifle raised at her back. "Don't move." Ruth froze. Matos shifted between her and the gun, but Pike smiled. "Step aside, Savage, or I shoot through you." "No," Klaus said from the water voice, hoarse. "Pike, let her go. This is between you and me." Pike's smile widened. "You're right." He shifted aim toward Klaus and fired. The shot was deafening. Klaus jerked backward, red blooming below his left shoulder. He staggered, caught himself against the wall, looked down at spreading blood. Ruth screamed, tried to run, but Mato held her back. "You can't. The water—" Klaus looked up at Ruth, expression soft. Open. Human. "I'm sorry," he mouthed, then pushed off the wall and let current take him toward the strongbox. "No." Ruth fought Mato's grip, but he was too strong. Klaus reached the strongbox and grabbed it with both arms, wrapping himself around it. Current pulled at him, dragging him toward the edge where floor dropped into darkness. He held on. Pike cursed and aimed for another shot, but Mato moved. Spun and threw his knife in one fluid motion, blade buried in Pike's shoulder. Pike screamed, dropped his rifle, stumbled back. Mato lunged, slammed Pike against the wall. They went down, fighting brutal tangle of fists and elbows and desperate violence. Ruth couldn't watch. She looked back at Klaus, still holding the strongbox, still being dragged toward the drop. His grip, weakening face pale with blood loss. "Let it go," Ruth shouted. Klaus let the box go. Klaus looked at her, understanding in his eyes. The box held proof. Without it, everything would be meaningless. But he was dying. He made his choice. Klaus tightened his grip, took a breath, kicked off toward a rocky outcrop near the edge. Slammed into it with his shoulder, drove the strongbox onto rocks, wedged it there. Then current caught him fully, and Klaus Erdmann was swept over the edge, into darkness. Ruth's scream echoed through the gallery, raw and tearing. She tried to run, but Mato grabbed her arms like iron bars. "He's gone," Mato said roughly. "Ruth, he's gone. Strongbox is wedged. We get it later. Right now we move or we all drown." Whitlow grabbed her other arm. "Water's still rising. We leave now or die here." Ruth couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Klaus was gone. Her husband, who'd tried to save the boundary maps and agency roles and failed, tried to protect her and failed, finally succeeded in doing one thing right and paid with his life. "Ruth?" Mato's voice was sharp, commanding. "Look at me." She met his eyes. "Klaus died so those boundary maps and agency roles could be recovered," Mato said. "Don't let his death be meaningless. Help me finish this." Ruth sucked in breath, forced herself to focus. Mato was right. She could fall apart later. Right now she had to survive. She nodded. They ran. Tunnels sloped upward, water sloshing around ankles. Behind them, gallery was collapsing timbers, giving way, stone crashing. Pike had collapsed against the wall, too weak from blood loss to follow. They emerged into night air, gasping and shaking. The riverbed below was no longer dry flood. From the mine had transformed it into churning torrent. Spanning the torrent was the trestle rotting and swaying in wind. Far side 3 horses. Well-dressed man holding rifle. The buyer. Walking toward center of trestle, moving with deliberate confidence. Silas Vance. He had something in his hand, leather folder wrapped in oilcloth. The forgeries. Copies good enough to make the sale without originals. "He's going to make it," Whitlow said. "We're too late." "No," Ruth said. She pulled the derringer. "I'm going after him." "Ruth, no." Mato began. "Yes." Ruth looked at him, feeling calm. "This ends now. If Vance makes that sale, everything Klaus died for means nothing. She started toward the trestle before anyone could stop her. The structure was worse than she'd feared. Planks missing, leaving gaps wide enough to fall through, railings rotted away, whole thing swaying with every step, groaning like something dying. Ruth kept walking one foot in front of the other. Vance saw her coming and stopped turning to face her. Even in moonlight, she could see his smile. "Well, well," Vance called. The sheriff's widow playing hero. Touching. "Give me the folder, Vance. Or what you'll shoot." Vance laughed. "This bridge is held together with hope. Fire that gun and the recoil alone might send you into the river." Ruth raised the derringer. "I'll take that chance." Vance's smile faltered. He looked at her, really looked, and saw she wasn't bluffing. "You're insane. Maybe. But I'm done with men like you." Ruth's voice was cold. "Men who take and never care who they hurt? I'm done being afraid. I'm done letting you win." She fired. The derringer cracked like thunder. Recoil slammed Ruth's arm back. She nearly lost balance but caught herself on the railing. Bullet missed Vance's head by inches, sparked off metal brace. Vance dove for cover, and the folder slipped from his hands. It tumbled through air pages, scattering, falling toward water below. "No!" Vance lunged for it, leaning far over railing, and the plank beneath him cracked with a sound like breaking bones. Vance fell. He grabbed the edge as he went down, fingers scrabbling, hanging suspended between trestle and river. His eyes found Ruth's raw terror in them. "Help me," Vance gasped. "Please, I'll tell you everything. Just please." Ruth stood frozen. Part of her wanted to help. Part remembered Vance was human. But she also remembered the families whose land he'd stolen. Matto's nephew shot while running. Klaus bleeding into floodwater. Some actions have consequences. Ruth didn't reach for Vance. She stood there and watched as his fingers slipped one by one from wet wood. He fell without sound, swallowed by black water. Then the trestle began to collapse. Started slowly, one support giving way, then another structure folding in on itself. Ruth ran, sprinting back toward bank planks, disintegrating behind her. She wasn't going to make it. Plank beneath her feet tilted and fell away. Ruth threw herself forward, hands outstretched, felt fingers close on solid ground. Strong hands grabbed her wrists, Matto's hands, and hauled her up onto bank. She collapsed, gasping, and Matto knelt beside her, checking for injuries with trembling hands. Behind them, trestle fell into river, with a sound like the world ending. "It's over," Whitlow said quietly, staring at wreckage. "They're gone." Ruth sat up slowly, whole body shaking. The buyer on far bank stared at wreckage a long moment, then mounted and rode away into night. "The strongbox," Ruth said. "We have to get it before the mine floods completely." "At dawn," Matto said. "When we can see. When water's settled." He looked at her, expression fierce. "You did it, Ruth. You stopped them." But Ruth didn't feel victorious. She felt empty, hollowed out. Klaus was dead. Vance was dead. Pike dying or dead. And Ruth had watched two men fall and done nothing to save them. She leaned against Matto without meaning to, and his arms settled around her shoulders, warm and steady. They sat on the riverbank. The sky began to lighten in east, and Ruth let herself be held while the world slowly, painfully began to make sense again. Federal Marshal arrived 5 days later. Carter was broad-shouldered, listened with narrowed eyes, examined flooded mine, and ruined trestle, sent 3 wires, Army Bureau of Indian Affairs Territorial Governor. Ruth led him to the mine at dawn. Water had receded enough to reach the gallery where Klaus died. Strongbox was still wedged on rocks where Klaus placed it, rusted but intact. Inside 43 land boundary maps and agency rolls, each carefully documented and signed, each representing a family that had trusted the treaty. Took 18 months, but Carter was thorough. 37 of 43 parcels returned to rightful owners. 6 families had died or disappeared, claims forfeit. But 37 families got their land back. Klaus's trial happened posthumously. Army confirmed desertion, confirmed theft, but also confirmed he died trying to stop greater crime. His name was cleared of land theft, even if desertion charge remained. Ruth sold the house, moved into a room behind the telegraph office. Ran the office with Eliza, posted fair rates, refused coded messages. And slowly, carefully began spending more time with Maddo. Not courting at first. Just walking together after she closed the office, sitting by the spring while he taught his nephew to track, talking about small things and large things. One evening, as sun set over the breaks, Maddo took her hand. "I want to see you," he said quietly. "Not for business, not for duty, just to see you." Ruth's heart stumbled. "I'd like that." 6 months later, he asked her to marry him. They were standing near the spring, watching his nephew teach their daughter now, to identify tracks. "Marry me," Maddo said. Not a question. Statement of intention. Ruth looked at him, this man who'd saved her life, fought beside her, stood with her, when the world tried to tear them apart, and felt something warm and terrifying bloom in her chest. Yes. They married spring 1873. Eliza stood as witness, wearing her best dress and fierce smile. Whitlow stood for Maddo, and afterward he and Eliza walked together, talking quietly. Ruth wore blue cotton with white lace. Maddo wore an embroidered vest that told stories in thread. They spoke their vows in front of people who loved them, and it was enough. Their daughter was born 1874. They named her Clara, after Ruth's mother. Gray eyes and steady hands. Their son came 1876. They named him Klaus. "You don't have to," Eliza protested. "I want to," Ruth said firmly. "He made terrible choices, but at the end, he tried to make it right. That deserves to be remembered." When Klaus was old enough to ask, Ruth told him the story. Not all, some parts too painful, but enough. She told him names carried weight, and that weight could be burden or gift, depending on what you chose to do with it. She told him justice wasn't a destination, but a journey. She told him courage wasn't absence of fear, but the choice to act anyway. Her children listened and asked if it was true. "Every word," Ruth said. 15 years later, Ruth stood on the cabin porch watching her children play. She was 43 now, hair turning silver, hands scarred from old injuries. Maddo came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. Thinking loud thoughts again. Ruth smiled and leaned back against him. "About how far we've come." He kissed her temple. "I found something yesterday." He pulled a brass army button from his pocket. "Near where my brother's lodge stood." Ruth took the button and turned it over. Small and ordinary, and representing so much death. "Let's bury it," she said. "Near the spring. Not to forget, but to remember." They walked to the spring together and dug a small hole. Ruth placed the button inside, and Maddo covered it with earth and stones. Later that night, Ruth wrote in the journal she kept for Clara, dear. "Clara, justice is not something that happens to you. It's something you make with your own hands. Love is not a lightning strike. It's something you build from trust and respect. Courage is not the absence of fear. It's the choice to act anyway. Your father and I built a life from ashes and floodwater. We built it for you. Don't waste it. Don't settle for safety when you could choose freedom. Remember, you are not alone. You never have to fight alone. With all my love, Your mother. Ruth closed the journal and slipped back into bed beside Maddo. His arm curved around her waist automatically, even in sleep. The story was over. The life had just begun. The end copy deep research, Chua Ju, 1002 Yu Kao. The telegraph key beneath Ruth Erdmann's fingers began to chatter at 4:30 on a Thursday afternoon in late September 1868. And the rhythm was wrong. 4 years of operating the key had taught Ruth to recognize different senders the way a musician recognizes another's playing style. Each operator had their own cadence, their own subtle variations in the spaces between dots and dashes. This sender was frantic, the message coming in bursts, like a man trying to speak while running, and Ruth's pencil scratched across the page as she transcribed. Cache is secure. Stop Erdmann compliant. Stop Pike. Arrives with keys. Stop move strongbox before equinox. Stop. The pencil slipped from Ruth's fingers and clattered onto the scarred wooden desk. She stared at what she'd written, her heart suddenly hammering against her ribs so hard it hurt. The afternoon light streaming through the window had turned thick and golden, painting the small telegraph office in shades of amber, and dust motes swirled in the beam like tiny creatures trapped in honey. Erdmann. That was Klaus. Her husband of 6 months, Sheriff Klaus Erdmann, a man who rose before dawn every morning to inspect Red Mesa with the precision of a military officer reviewing troops. And Pike. Avery Pike. She knew that name too. 3 weeks ago, she'd been organizing medical supplies in the back room of Dr. Whitlow's surgery next door, when she'd heard Klaus's voice through the thin wall, low and urgent. If Pike shows up here, Nathaniel will have a problem. The man's wanted for stealing Army payroll 2 years back, 20,000 in gold coin, if anyone connects him to what happened in the breaks. The rest had been swallowed by the sound of wagons passing outside, but Ruth had tucked the name away in her memory, alongside all the other fragments of her husband's secret life. Ruth's hands trembled as she copied the message into her personal ledger, the secret book she kept hidden beneath a false bottom in her desk drawer. She'd started keeping duplicates 6 months ago, after she'd noticed Silas Vance, the freight agent, altering shipping manifests and then claiming the originals had never existed. It had seemed like a small act of rebellion at the time, a way to hold on to truth in a town where truth seemed increasingly negotiable. Now that small act might be the only thing standing between her and complete ignorance of what her husband was involved in. She fed the original telegram slip into the potbelly stove and watched it curl and blacken the paper browning at the edges before bursting into brief flame. When it was nothing but ash, Ruth stood and walked to the window, pressing her forehead against the cool glass. Red Mesa stretched before her. 20 buildings crouched along a dusty wagon road like animals waiting for the water that never came. The river that had once run through the center of town was nothing but a wide scar of cracked mud and sun-bleached stones, now testament to 3 years of drought that had killed cattle and broken farmers. Maybe 80 people called this place home, though Ruth suspected that number dropped every season as families gave up and moved east. Ruth had married Klaus Erdmann to escape her father's debts. Amos Brandt had been a gambler with a talent for losing, and by the time Ruth turned 22, men with hard eyes and quiet voices had started appearing at their door talking about what happened to people who didn't pay what they owed. When Klaus had offered marriage practical business-like, with terms as clear as any contract, Ruth had accepted with the same efficiency she brought to transcribing shipping manifests. It had been a transaction. He needed a telegraph operator and a respectable household. She needed safety and a door that locked from the inside. They maintained separate rooms, spoke mainly about weather and freight schedules, and treated each other with the distant courtesy of boarders sharing a lodging house. But lately Klaus had changed. He'd stopped sleeping. Ruth heard him pacing at night, heard the stove being stoked at 2 a.m, heard him muttering to himself in German, a language he only spoke when he thought no one was listening. He burned papers in the jail office she'd noticed watching through the window as flames consumed what looked like official documents. His saddlebags clinked when he rode out after dark, heavy with something metallic, and he returned with his hands scraped raw and dirt under his fingernails as though he'd been digging. Ruth had told herself it was none of her business. Their marriage was a business arrangement after all. But now his name was on a coded telegram, linked to a wanted criminal and a strongbox that needed moving before the autumn equinox, which was 2 days away. She couldn't ignore this anymore. Ruth locked the telegraph office and walked home, taking the long route past the schoolhouse where Eliza Boone was dismissing her handful of students. Eliza was 34, sharp-tongued and sharper-eyed, and she caught sight of Ruth immediately. "You have that look," Eliza said, stepping onto the schoolhouse porch. "The one that says trouble's coming and you're trying to decide whether to meet it head-on or run." Ruth glanced around to make sure the street was empty, then pulled out the copied telegram. "Read this." Eliza scanned it quickly, her expression darkening. "Pike. Nathaniel mentioned him once back when we were—" She trailed off, her mouth tightening. Dr. Nathaniel Whitlow and Eliza had been courting 2 years ago, until Whitlow had abruptly ended things, claiming professional propriety. Eliza had never quite forgiven him. "What did he tell you?" Ruth asked. "That Pike was a lieutenant at Fort Harlan during the Lakota relocations. He stole a payroll shipment and disappeared before the Army could court-martial him. That was 2 years ago, right around when the Army burned the camp in the breaks." Ruth finished. "Matto's brother's camp." Eliza's eyes sharpened. "You think they're connected?" "I think Klaus has been riding out at night with heavy saddlebags. I think Vance has been sending coded messages. And I think someone is moving something valuable in the next 2 days." Ruth tucked the telegram back into her pocket. "I need to know what Klaus is involved in before it destroys everything." "Be careful," Eliza warned. "Men like Vance don't forgive inconvenient questions." Ruth nodded and continued home. The house was dark when she arrived, the Klaus's bay gelding gone from the small stable. Ruth lit a lamp with a sulfur match and stood in the doorway of Klaus's room, her pulse loud in her ears. She'd only been in here twice before, both times to leave folded laundry. The room was austere, a rope bed with a thin mattress, a trunk at the foot, a washstand with a chipped basin, and a small desk beneath the window. On the desk sat a stack of papers weighted down with a smooth river stone. Ruth's hands shook as she lifted the stone. The papers were survey maps, hand-drawn in Klaus's precise script. She recognized the terrain immediately. The breaks, the maze of red rock canyons north of town where Matto lived and hunted. Someone had marked parcels with blue ink, neat rectangles labeled with numbers. But in the corner of one map, in Klaus's unmistakable handwriting, were words that made Ruth's blood run cold: White Elk Grant. Household plots on agency rolls. Treaty Fort Laramie Art du 6. Original boundary maps and agency rolls secured from Pike Raid Site 1866. Hidden for leverage. Ruth stared at the words, her mind racing. White Elk was Matto's brother, killed 2 years ago when the Army burned the camp. And Klaus had written original boundary maps and agency rolls. Not copies, not forgeries, but originals. Which meant Klaus had been at that raid. Which meant Klaus had taken something that didn't belong to him. But, hidden for leverage, suggested Klaus had taken them to use against someone. Against Pike hoofbeats sounded outside. Ruth quickly replaced the papers exactly as she'd found them, the stone centered perfectly on top, and slipped out of the room. Klaus entered through the kitchen moments later, hanging his hat on the peg by the door. He looked exhausted, 10 years older than his 45 years. "Evening," he said without meeting her eyes. "Would you be home for supper?" Ruth asked, keeping her voice level. "No. Patrol." He paused, something flickering across his face. guilt, maybe, or fear. "Don't wait up." He left before Ruth could respond. She watched through the window as he rode east toward the dry riverbed, then quickly changed into her irregular riding skirt with the hem tied up over bloomer-style underpants, a scandalous garment she'd sewn herself because riding side saddle was both impractical and dangerous, and saddled her dun mare. She was going to follow him. She was going to find out what Klaus Erdmann was hiding, even if it meant riding straight into whatever darkness he was running toward. The mare tossed her head nervously as Ruth mounted ears flicking toward the horizon where storm clouds were building dark and heavy against the fading light. The air tasted metallic like lightning waiting to be born. Ruth urged the mare forward anyway, following Klaus's tracks along the dry riverbed. The bay's left rear shoe was chipped, leaving a distinctive mark Ruth had learned to recognize. She stayed far enough back that Klaus wouldn't hear her close enough that she wouldn't lose him in the failing light. The clouds moved faster than she'd expected, turning the sky the color of old copper, and the mare began to dance sideways, nostrils flaring. Then the dust storm hit. It came from the west, like the wrath of an angry god, a churning wall of sand and fury that turned the air solid. The mare screamed a high, terrified sound and reared. Ruth grabbed for the reins, but they slipped through her fingers' leather, burning across her palms. She hit the ground hard, the impact driving the breath from her lungs, and by the time she could breathe again, the mare was gone, and the storm was everywhere. Ruth ran blindly, one arm raised to shield her face. Dust filled her mouth and nose, thick as wool, and each breath was agony. Her skirt caught on yucca spines and tore. Sharp stones cut through her boot soles. The world had turned into a howling nightmare of grit and darkness, and Ruth knew with cold certainty that she was going to die out here. Something buzzed beneath her foot, dry and rattling and deadly. Ruth threw herself sideways as the rattlesnake struck fangs flashing past her ankles so close she felt the heat of its body. She scrambled away on hands and knees, scraping skin from her palms on sharp stones, and when she tried to stand, her legs buckled. She collapsed against a twisted juniper tree, her vision narrowing to a pinpoint. She fumbled for her handkerchief and pressed it over her mouth and nose. But breathing through the fabric was like trying to breathe through mud. The darkness at the edges of her vision spread inward. Ruth's last thought was that this was a stupid way to die, chasing a husband who barely knew her name, into a storm that didn't care about stupid or smart, only strong and weak. Then strong hands gripped her shoulders, and she was lifted over a broad shoulder and carried at a run. She heard gunfire, two sharp cracks that cut through the howling wind, and whoever carried her didn't slow, just kept running with ground-eating strides that spoke of someone who knew this land the way sailors know the sea. A door crashed open. Ruth was set down on hard-packed earth, and a wool blanket was wrapped around her and pulled up over her head, creating a pocket of breathable air. Then she was lifted again, cradled against someone's chest, and a hand cupped the back of her head with surprising gentleness. Through the wool, Ruth could hear a heartbeat, steady, unhurried calm. Her body made a decision her mind couldn't. It relaxed. The tension drained from her muscles, and her breathing began to slow, matching the rhythm of that heartbeat beneath her ear. She smelled wood smoke and sage and something else, something clean and wild like rain on hot stone. The roar of the storm faded to a dull howl. Ruth's eyes closed and she slept. Dawn light woke her pale gold filtering through gaps in log walls. Ruth lay on a dirt floor, still wrapped in the wool blanket, every muscle screaming. Her mouth tasted like copper and sand, and when she sat up slowly, her head swam. She was in a small cabin, or what remained of one. The roof sagged dangerously in the middle. Broken furniture lay scattered in corners. Morning light streamed through a shattered window. And beside her, back against the wall, sat the man who had saved her. Maddo. Ruth recognized him immediately. He was impossible not to notice, tall, broad-shouldered, maybe 35 years old, with black hair pulled back in a single braid. His left eye was clouded milky white from some old injury, but his right eye was dark and sharp as obsidian. He wore buckskin trousers and a much-mended cotton shirt, and a bone-handled knife hung at his belt. Some townsfolk called him Blind Otis, mocking the damaged eye. Ruth had always hated that casual cruelty. His good eye opened and fixed on her face. "You're awake." Ruth's voice came out as a rasp. "You saved me." "Yes." "Why?" Something flickered in his expression, surprise maybe. "Because you needed saving. That's reason enough." Ruth pulled the blanket tighter, her hands shaking. "Thank you. I heard gunshots. Someone was shooting at us." Maddow reached beside him and held out a leather canteen. "At the cabin after I got you inside. Drink slowly." Ruth took the canteen with trembling hands and sipped. The water was warm and tasted faintly of leather, but it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever tasted. "Did you see who?" "No. But I found these outside." He pulled 3 brass shotgun shell casings from his belt. "Fresh. Someone wanted us dead or scared." Before Ruth could respond, horses' hooves thundered outside and the door burst open. 4 men on horseback crowded the frame silhouetted against the rising sun. Silas Vance sat at the front, lean and silver-haired, with a smile like a knife blade. "Well, well, what have we here? The sheriff's little wife spending the night with a one-eyed savage. That's going to make for some mighty interesting conversation over breakfast." Ruth scrambled to her feet, face burning with humiliation and fury. Then another horse approached, and her husband's voice cut through the morning air like a whip. "Step away from my wife." Klaus Erdmann dismounted and strode forward, his hand on his Colt revolver, a Navy model Ruth noticed 36 caliber with a worn walnut grip. His face was white with rage jaw, so tight she could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. "Klaus," Ruth began, but her voice was still hoarse. "Quiet." Klaus didn't look at her. He stared at Maddow with naked fury. "I said step away." Maddow rose to his feet in one fluid motion, positioning himself between Ruth and the doorway. He didn't reach for his knife. He simply stood, and that made him more dangerous than any weapon. "She was dying in the storm," Maddow said calmly. "I brought her here, kept her breathing. That's all." "That's all?" Vance's voice dripped false concern. "Klaus, your wife spends the night alone with a savage, and he says, that's all. Folks in town are going to have strong opinions." Klaus's hand tightened on his revolver. "Vance, take your men and leave, now. No need to be unfriendly." Vance gestured lazily toward the cabin wall where fresh buckshot marks scarred the logs. "Looks like someone already expressed their opinion. Wonder who—" Ruth pulled the crumpled telegram from her pocket with shaking hands. "This is why I followed you." Klaus's gaze snapped to the telegram, and for the first time, something other than rage crossed his face. Raw, naked fear. Vance's smile vanished. He straightened in his saddle hand, drifting toward his rifle. "Where did you get that, Mrs. Erdmann?" "It came through the public telegraph yesterday. Misdirected." Ruth's voice was steadier now, anger burning through exhaustion. "You were careless, Vance." Klaus took the telegram with fingers that trembled slightly. He read it, his face turning ashen. When he looked at Ruth, his expression was anguished. "You followed me. You could have died." "I almost did." Klaus studied her face for a long moment, then looked at Vance with an expression Ruth had never seen before, something dark and final. "We're done here, Vance. All of us. No more." "We're done when I say we're done," Vance snapped. "Erdmann, you've got until sundown to get your house in order. Pike arrives tonight with the keys. Have yours ready, or... He looked at Ruth, and his eyes were cold as January frost. Or accidents happen. Storms, snakes, falls from horses. Terrible things. He wheeled his horse and rode off, his men following. Klaus stood in the doorway, still holding the telegram, looking like a man watching his own execution approach. "Klaus," Ruth said quietly, "please, tell me what's happening." Klaus looked at her, and for one moment she saw past the coldness to the exhaustion and fear beneath. Then his expression hardened. "Go home, Ruth. Stay there. Don't leave. Don't talk to anyone, and I mean it. Stay away from this." He turned to Maddo. "You, gone by sundown. If I see you after dark, I'll arrest you." "This is my land," Maddo said. "My brother's land. You know that." "Not anymore. The land's been sold." Klaus turned and walked to his horse. "Ruth, come on." Ruth hesitated, looking at Maddo. Their eyes met, and she wanted to say something. "Thank you. I'm sorry, I'll fix this," but the words wouldn't come. "Go," Maddo said softly. "Be safe." Ruth nodded and followed Klaus to his horse. He boosted her up and mounted behind her, his arm tight around her waist, and they rode back to Red Mesa in silence. Behind them, Maddo stood in the cabin doorway and watched them disappear. Then he turned and walked into the breaks, toward the canyons, where survey stakes marked land that was supposed to be protected by treaty. Someone was stealing his home. Last night, someone had tried to kill the woman who might help improve it. Maddo didn't know much about Ruth Erdman, but he knew she was brave. He'd felt it in the way she'd gripped his shirt during the storm, trusting without reason. He'd seen it in her eyes this morning, refusing to look away, even when her husband's fury could have burned her to ash. She would come back. He was certain of it. And when she did, he would be ready. Red Mesa looked different after the storm. Everything filmed with a layer of fine copper-colored dust. Klaus rode straight through town, without stopping, ignoring the stares that followed them. Ruth kept her eyes forward, but she could feel the weight of those stares, could almost hear the whispers starting sheriff's wife. Savage. All night alone. They reached the house, and Klaus dismounted without a word. He lifted Ruth down with impersonal efficiency and walked inside, leaving her standing in the yard like forgotten furniture. Ruth followed him into his room and found him pulling the survey maps from his desk, rolling them with sharp, angry movements. "Klaus," Ruth said from the doorway. "Talk to me." "There's nothing to talk about. That telegram says otherwise. Erdman compliant. What does that mean?" Klaus's hands stilled. For a long moment he didn't move, didn't breathe. Then he turned to face her, and his expression was bleak, hollowed out like a house gutted by fire. "It means I made a terrible mistake 5 years ago," Klaus said quietly. "A mistake that's been following me ever since, getting bigger and darker until it's consumed everything. It means Silas Vance has information that could see me hanged for treason, and he's been using that to control me. And it means you need to stay out of this before you get hurt, before you get killed." Ruth's breath caught. "Treason, Klaus, what did you do?" Klaus set the maps down carefully, as though they might shatter. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I deserted. December 1863, right after Chattanooga. I was Lieutenant Klaus Erdman, 4th Artillery Union Army. I'd spent 2 years calculating trajectories and loading cannons and watching men die because of my calculations. I was good at it. Too good. They gave me commendations, promotions. And all I could think about was how many men I'd killed who'd never done anything to me." He paused, hands clenching into fists. "So I planned to steal something. Artillery designs, I thought. Engineering documents I could sell to start over. But when I broke into the command tent that night, What I found wasn't artillery designs. It was land boundary maps and agency rolls. Original treaty documents from Fort Laramie granting 40-acre parcels to Lakota families. And I found evidence that Lieutenant Avery Pike was planning to steal them during a raid on a camp in the Breaks. Ruth's heart hammered. You took the boundary maps and agency rolls. I took them, Klaus confirmed. I thought if I had them I could stop Pike, expose him, do one good thing before I disappeared. But I was a fool. Pike had already set the raid in motion. I got to the camp too late. 4 people died in the fire, including a child. Maddo's nephew, 8 years old. His voice cracked. I tried to save them. I pulled 2 people from the flames, but I was too late. And by the time the soldiers left, I had the blood of innocents on my hands, and a satchel full of boundary maps and agency rolls I didn't know what to do with. So you hid them, Ruth said, the pieces falling into place. I hid them in the old silver mine in a strongbox. Thought maybe someday I could figure out how to return them. But then Vance found me 2 years ago. He'd tracked me through Army records, found the warrant for desertion, and he made me an offer where the badge in Red Mesa looked the other way when he and Pike needed me to, and my past stays buried. If I refused, he'd turn me in and I'd hang. Klaus's shoulders sagged. I thought I could control it, keep it small. But Pike showed up 6 months ago with that stolen payroll, and Vance saw an opportunity to make real money. They forced me to help them create forgeries of the boundary maps and agency rolls I'd hidden, sell the land to speculators. And when I refused, Vance reminded me that he knew where I'd hidden the originals, that he could take them any time and I'd have nothing, no leverage, no proof, no way to stop them. Ruth stared at her husband, seeing him clearly for the first time. Not a cold, distant man, but a broken one crushed under the weight of good intentions that had gone catastrophically wrong. Tonight, Klaus continued, Pike arrives with keys to the strongbox. They're moving it to the buyer at the old trestle. Once the sale goes through, Vance will kill me because I'm a witness. I've always known that's how this ends. He crossed to his trunk, pulled out a small Derringer pistol and a leather flask, and pressed them into Ruth's hands. The Derringers loaded 2 shots, 41 caliber rimfire. The flask has water for 2 days. If something happens to me tonight, you take these and ride to Prescott. Find the federal marshal. Tell him everything. Ruth looked at the gun, then at Klaus. I'm not leaving you, not leaving. Yes, you are. No. Ruth closed her fingers around the Derringer. You tried to do the right thing, Klaus. You failed, but you tried. And now you're trying again. That means something. That means I'm not abandoning you when you need someone to stand with you. Klaus's expression cracked, and for a moment Ruth saw naked gratitude beneath the guilt. Then he turned away, shoulders rigid. Do what you want, but don't say I didn't warn you. He walked past her and out the door, mounting his horse and riding toward town without looking back. Ruth stood in the empty house, holding a Derringer and a flask of water, and thought about the girl she'd been 6 months ago, desperate, frightened, willing to marry a stranger to escape her father's debts. That girl would have taken the gun and the water and ridden for Prescott. But Ruth wasn't that girl anymore. She tucked the Derringer into her boot, the flask into her pocket, and walked quickly to the telegraph office. Eliza was waiting on the steps, arms crossed, worry carved into every line of her face. Everyone's talking. Vance is spreading stories about you and Maddo. Half the town thinks you're ruined, and the other half thinks Maddo forced you. I don't care, Ruth said bluntly. Klaus just told me everything. Vance and Pike are moving stolen land boundary maps and agency rolls tonight, original treaty documents that Klaus took from Pike to stop him. But now Vance controls. They're selling them to a buyer at the trestle. We have to stop them. Eliza's eyes widened. Klaus took the boundary maps and agency rolls to stop Pike. It's complicated. But right now, we need Dr. Whitlow. He treated survivors from the raid. He might know something that can help us. Eliza hesitated, old hurt flickering across her face. Then she nodded. I'll get him. She returned 20 minutes later with Nathaniel Whitlow. He was thin and gray-haired, moving with the careful precision of a man who'd spent too many years setting bones and sewing wounds. He read the telegram Ruth showed him, and his face went pale. This is worse than I thought, Whitlow said quietly. If they're moving original treaty documents, they're not just committing fraud. They're erasing legal protections for entire families. It's an act of war against the Lakota people. Can you help us? Ruth asked. Whitlow hesitated, then nodded. The strongbox is in the old silver mine. I know because one of the survivors told me he'd seen soldiers loading something heavy into the upper tunnels during the raid. And there's a ventilation shaft on the north side, narrow, but we could fit. Ruth felt her pulse quicken. Then we go tonight. We get proof of what Vance and Pike have done, and we stop them before they make that sale. That's suicide, Whitlow said. They have men, guns. We have the truth. Ruth interrupted. And we have Maddow. He knows those tunnels better than anyone. You're going back to him? Whitlow asked. I'm going to ask him to help us finish what Klaus started, Ruth said. And I think he'll say yes. Ruth found Maddow at the ruined cabin, as dusk fell, sharpening his knife with a whetstone. He looked up as she approached, his good eye unreadable. Your husband told you to stay away from me, Maddow said. He did. I'm not very good at following orders I don't agree with. Maddow's mouth twitched, almost a smile. I noticed. Ruth pulled out the telegram and Whitlow's rough map of the mine tunnels. I know where the strongbox is. I know when they're moving it. And I know why the army burned your brother's camp 2 years ago. Maddow's knife stilled. He stood slowly, his whole body tense. Why? To steal land boundary maps and agency rolls. Treaty grants proving your brother and other families owned 40 acres each. Klaus witnessed Pike planning the raid and stole the originals to stop him. But he was too late to prevent the attack. He's been hiding the boundary maps and agency rolls ever since, and now Vance is using them and Klaus's desertion to control him. Ruth took a breath. I'm going to get those boundary maps and agency rolls back tonight, and I need your help. Maddow studied her face for a long moment. Why are you doing this? Because it's right, Ruth said. And because I'm tired of being afraid. And because... She hesitated, then finished quietly. Because you saved my life, and some debts can only be paid by standing together when it matters. Maddow's expression softened slightly. All right, I'll help. But when this is over, if we're still alive, you're going to tell me the real reason. Ruth's breath caught. The real reason. The one you're not saying out loud. His good eye held hers dark and steady. The one that has nothing to do with debts or duty. Ruth's cheeks burned, but she didn't look away. If we're still alive, then let's make sure we are, Maddow said. They reached the silver mine just after full dark, moving through the breaks, with Whitlow trailing behind, his breathing labored. The mine entrance was boarded up with rotting planks, a rusted chain looped through a padlock, and a hand-painted sign warning, "Danger, flooded, no entry." Maddow led them around the hill to the north side, where the ventilation shaft opened like a mouth in the ground. The iron grate that had once covered it lay to one side, corroded through in places. Mato pulled a length of rope from his belt and tied one end to a sturdy juniper root. "I'll go first," he said. "Wait until I call up, then follow." He disappeared into the shaft, descending hand over hand with easy confidence. Ruth listened to the scrape of his boots against stone, the faint rustle of his breath. And then his voice drifted up. "Clear. Come down." Ruth went next, gripping the rope so tightly her knuckles went white. The shaft was narrow and cold, smelling of damp earth and old water, and it seemed to go on forever. Her boots slipped on wet stone, and once she nearly lost her grip, but she forced herself to keep moving hand over hand, down and down into the belly of the earth. Her feet hit solid ground, and Mato's hand steadied her elbow. They were in a tunnel barely tall enough to stand upright, with timber supports groaning under the weight of the mountain above. Somewhere ahead, faint lamplight flickered, and voices drifted toward them, muffled but distinct. Whitlow descended last, breathing hard, his rifle slung across his back. When he joined them at the bottom, Mato gestured for silence and led them forward through the darkness. They moved slowly, placing each foot carefully to avoid dislodging loose stones. The tunnel branched multiple times, some passages leading down toward the water-filled lower levels, others sloping up toward the main galleries. Mato navigated by touch and memory, his good eye useless in the dark, but his spatial awareness apparently perfect. The voices grew louder. Ruth could make out words now carried through the tunnels by some trick of acoustics. "Before dawn. Erdman's got the keys. You bring the mules. 3 strong ones. This is heavy." That was Vance's voice, smug and satisfied. "Good. Pike wants it on the trestle by first light. Then we're done with this backwater and done with that fool sheriff." Ruth's hands clenched into fists. They were talking about Klaus like he was garbage to be discarded once his usefulness ended, which she supposed was exactly what Vance planned to do. Mato stopped at the edge of a side tunnel and peered around the corner into the main gallery. Ruth crept up beside him and looked through the gap. The gallery was enormous, easily 50 feet across, with a ceiling lost in shadow. In the center sat a strong box on a handcart, iron-banded and heavy enough that it had worn grooves in the wooden planks beneath. Around it stood 5 men, Vance lean and silver-haired, a sharp-faced man with a scar across his jaw who could only be Avery Pike, 2 others in army uniforms that looked too clean to be authentic, and Klaus. Her husband stood apart from the others, his arms crossed over his chest and his face haggard. He looked like a man who'd spent too many nights without sleep, too many days carrying burdens that crushed the spirit even when they didn't break the body. "You brought the keys?" Vance asked. Klaus pulled a key ring from his pocket and tossed it to Pike. The keys jangled as they arced through the air, and Pike caught them with a practiced snatch. "That's all of them. Now give me the documents you promised." "Hurrah, soon as we're across the trestle and the buyer pays up," Vance said. His smile was all teeth sharp and predatory. "What's the rush, Erdman? Afraid your little wife is going to figure out what you've been up to?" "Too late for that, I think. She already knows too much. Pity. She seemed like a smart girl." Klaus's hand drifted toward his revolver. "You leave her alone, Vance. She's not part of this. She made herself part of it when she followed you into the storm." Vance's smile widened. "Don't worry. I'll make it quick. An accident, like I said. Tragic, but these things happen." Klaus's face went white with fury, but before he could move, a bell began to ring in the distance. 3 long, urgent peals that echoed through the tunnels like a scream. Eliza's signal. Something had gone wrong. In the gallery, chaos erupted. Pike barked orders, his voice cracking like a whip. "Someone's onto us. Move, now." Vance grabbed a lantern and thrust it at one of his men. "Get the mules. We're taking the back road to the trestle. Erdman, you're with me." Klaus didn't move. He stood frozen, staring toward the tunnel entrance, as though he could see through stone and darkness to the town beyond. His hand gripped his revolver, and for a moment Ruth thought he would turn on Vance and end this here and now. But he didn't. He took a breath, squared his shoulders, and nodded. "Let's go." Ruth wanted to scream. She wanted to run into the gallery and grab Klaus by the collar and shake him until he remembered who he was supposed to be. But Mato's hand closed around her wrist, holding her still. "Not yet." He breathed into her ear. "Wait." "For what?" Ruth whispered back. "For them to move. Once they're in the tunnels, we'll have the advantage." Mato's good eye glinted in the faint lamplight. "I know this mine. They don't." Whitlow nodded agreement, his face grim. "He's right. If we go now, they'll hear us and we'll be trapped." Ruth forced herself to breathe, to think, to trust Mato's judgment. In the gallery, Pike's men were loading the strongbox onto the handcart, straining under its weight. Vance held a lantern high, illuminating a passage that led deeper into the mine, toward the lower levels where water waited like a patient predator. They started moving the handcart's wheels, squealing in protest, and Ruth saw Klaus glance back one last time before disappearing into the darkness. Then they were gone, swallowed by the tunnel's mouth, and Mato was moving silent as smoke, tracking them by sound and instinct. Ruth and Whitlow followed, and the darkness closed around them like water, cold and absolute. The tunnel sloped downward, and Ruth heard water before she saw it, a distant roar that grew louder with each step, like thunder trapped underground. The air grew colder and damper, thick with the smell of wet stone and algae and something metallic that might have been rust or might have been old blood. Mato stopped at a junction where 3 passages met, tilting his head to listen. Ruth heard voices echoing from the left-hand tunnel, distorted by distance, and the strange acoustics of the mine. She heard the squeal of the handcart wheels, the splash of boots in standing water, the harsh rasp of men breathing hard under exertion. "They're taking the flooded route," Mato murmured, trying to reach the main shaft that connects to the riverbed. "But the water's higher than they expect. Last night's storm filled the lower levels faster than the mine can drain." "Will they make it through?" Whitlow asked quietly. "Maybe, if they're fast and lucky." Mato's expression was grim. "Or they'll drown trying." Ruth thought about Klaus, wading through rising water in the dark, and felt her chest tighten with fear she didn't want to name. He'd made his choices. He'd helped Vance and Pike steal land and destroy lives. He'd earned whatever punishment was coming. But he was still her husband. And some part of her, the part that remembered his careful courtesy, his quiet protection, the way he'd given her a derringer and a flask, and told her to run, still cared what happened to him. "We need to move," Ruth said. "If they reach the trestle before we can stop them." "They won't," Mato interrupted. He pulled his knife and tested the edge with his thumb. "There's another way. Faster. More dangerous, but faster." "Show us," Ruth said. Mato led them down the right-hand tunnel, moving at a pace that was just short of running. The tunnel narrowed until Ruth's shoulders brushed both walls, and the ceiling dropped so low they had to crouch. Water seeped through cracks in the stone cold and relentless, soaking through Ruth's borrowed shirt and making her shiver. They emerged into a larger chamber, and Ruth stopped so fast, Whitlow nearly collided with her. The chamber was flooded. Black water stretched from wall to wall, its surface broken only by rotting timber supports that jutted up like broken teeth. The water looked deep, impossibly deep, and Ruth could hear the current moving beneath the surface, a low thrumming sound that spoke of hidden channels and underwater caves. "We have to cross this," Mato said. "It's the only way to reach the main shaft before Vance does." "How deep is it?" Whitlow asked, his voice tight. maybe 6 feet in the center, shallower near the walls. Maddo pointed toward a narrow ledge that ran along the left side of the chamber, barely a foot wide. We can use that, but move slow. The rock's slick. Ruth looked at the ledge, at the black water waiting below, and felt her stomach drop. She'd never been a strong swimmer. Growing up in a desert town during a drought didn't provide many opportunities to learn. I'll go first, Maddo said as though reading her thoughts. Then Ruth, then Doc. If anyone slips, grab the wall. Don't try to catch yourself or you'll pull someone else in with you. He started across the ledge, his movements careful and deliberate, one hand braced against the wall. Ruth followed, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. The ledge was slick with algae and condensation, and her boots slipped with every step. She pressed her back against the wall, inching sideways, trying not to look down at the water below. Halfway across, her foot slipped. Ruth gasped and grabbed for the wall, her fingers scrabbling against wet stone. For one terrible moment, she felt herself falling, felt gravity take hold. And then Maddo's hand shot out and grabbed her wrist. "I've got you," he said. His voice was calm, steady, the same voice he'd used during the dust storm. "Find your footing. Slowly." Ruth's boot touched the ledge again, and she pressed herself flat against the wall, breathing hard. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet." Maddo released her wrist, but stayed close, ready to catch her if she slipped again. "Keep moving. We're almost across." They reached the far side of the chamber, and Ruth's legs were shaking so badly she nearly collapsed. Whitlow came last, his rifle held high to keep it out of the water, his face gray as old ash. "I'm getting too old for this," he muttered. Maddo didn't answer. He was already moving again, following the tunnel toward the sound of voices and water and the promise of violence waiting at the end. They caught up to Vance's group in a gallery where the tunnel opened into a natural cavern 40 feet high and twice as wide. Water covered the floor knee-deep here, black and churning, and the current was strong enough to make walking difficult. Vance and his men were struggling to push the handcart through the flood, and the strongbox swaying dangerously with each step. Klaus waited beside them, one hand braced on the cart to keep it from tipping, his face set in lines of grim determination. He looked exhausted, more than exhausted, hollowed out, like a man who'd given up hope of salvation and was simply going through the motions until the end came. Pike stood at the front lantern, held high, shouting directions that no one could hear over the roar of the water. And then, without warning, the floor beneath the handcart gave way. It happened fast. The rotted planks splintered, the cart lurched sideways, and the strongbox slid toward the water. Klaus lunged, grabbing for it, and managed to hook his arm through one of the iron bands. The weight nearly pulled him under, but he held on his boots, scrabbling for purchase on the broken planks. "Help me," Klaus shouted. "It's going to—" The cart collapsed completely. The strongbox fell, dragging Klaus with it, and they both hit the water hard. Klaus's head went under, and for a moment Ruth couldn't see anything but churning foam and debris. Then Klaus surfaced, gasping, still holding onto the strongbox with one arm, while the other clawed at the water, trying to keep his head above the flood. The current was pulling him downstream toward the main shaft, where the water dropped into unknown depths. Vance stood on the bank watching, and he was smiling. "Well," Vance said, raising his voice to be heard over the water. "That solves one problem. Goodbye, Erdmann. Can't say it's been a pleasure." He turned away, gesturing for his men to follow, and Ruth snapped. She pulled the derringer from her boot and stepped into the lamplight, the gun raised and aimed at Vance's back. Nobody move? Every head turned. Vance's expression shifted from satisfaction to fury to cold calculation in the space of a breath. "Mrs. Erdmann," he said, his voice dripping with false concern. You really should have stayed home. This is no place for a lady." "I'm not a lady," Ruth said. Her hand was steady on the derringer, though inside she felt like she was vibrating apart. "I'm a telegraph operator with very good aim and absolutely nothing left to lose. Drop your guns, all of you." Pike laughed a harsh bark. "You've got 2 shots, girl. There are 5 of us. Bad odds." "2 shots is enough," Ruth said. "I can kill Vance and you before your men even draw. That leaves 3 against 2. She jerked her chin toward Maddow and Whitlow, who had stepped into the light behind her, weapons ready. "Actually, 3 against 3. Even odds. You feeling lucky, Pike?" Pike's smile faded. He looked at Vance, who was staring at Ruth with an expression of pure hatred. "You're bluffing," Vance said. "Try me." For a long moment, nobody moved. The gallery filled with the sound of rushing water and harsh breathing, and the distant creak of rotting timbers giving way under impossible pressure. Then Klaus's voice cut through the tension, raw and desperate. "Ruth, help can't hold." Ruth's gaze flickered toward her husband. Klaus was still in the water, still holding onto the strongbox, but his grip was weakening. His face had gone pale, his lips blue with cold. And the current was dragging him closer to the edge where the gallery floor dropped away into nothing. Ruth made a decision. She lowered the derringer slightly, just enough that it wasn't pointing directly at Vance, and said to Maddow, "Get him. I'll cover you." Maddow didn't hesitate. He splashed into the water, moving with shocking speed despite the current, and reached Klaus just as the sheriff's grip on the strongbox failed. Maddow grabbed Klaus's shirt with one hand and the strongbox with the other, his face tightening with effort. But the strongbox was too heavy. It was dragging them both under, and Maddow couldn't hold both. "Let it go," Ruth shouted. Maddow let the box go. Maddow looked at her, and in his good eye, Ruth saw understanding. The box held the stolen boundary maps and agency rolls, the proof they needed to return the land to its rightful owners. If they lost it now, everything they'd fought for would be meaningless. But Klaus was drowning. Maddow's jaw clenched. He looked at Klaus, then at the strongbox, and then he made his own decision. He released the box. It sank immediately, disappearing into the black water without a sound. Maddow hauled Klaus toward the bank, fighting the current every inch of the way. Whitlow waded in to help, and together they pulled the sheriff onto solid ground. Klaus collapsed, coughing up water, his whole body shaking with cold and exhaustion. "The box," Klaus gasped. "Did you—" "It's gone," Maddow said flatly. "Sunk. We'll find it later after we deal with Vance." But when Ruth looked up, Vance and Pike were already moving. They'd used the distraction to slip away, abandoning their men, disappearing into one of the side tunnels with a speed born of desperation and long practice at running from consequences. "Blast!" Whitlow swore. He raised his rifle, but it was too late. The tunnel had swallowed them. Pike's remaining men looked at each other, then at Ruth's derringer, then at the water rising steadily around their boots. One of them dropped his gun and raised his hands. The other 2 followed suit. "Smart," Maddow said. He picked up the discarded weapons and threw them into the water. "Get out. Back the way you came. If I see any of you again, I won't be this merciful." The men didn't need to be told twice. They scrambled toward the tunnel entrance, slipping and stumbling in their haste to escape. Ruth lowered the derringer, her hands finally beginning to shake. She looked at Klaus, who was sitting with his back against the cavern wall, his head in his hands, and felt something inside her chest crack open. "Klaus," she said softly. He looked up at her, and his eyes were haunted. "I'm sorry, Ruth. For everything. For lying to you, for putting you in danger, for—" His voice broke. "For being such a damn coward." Ruth knelt beside him, not caring that the water soaked through her split skirt, and took his cold hand in hers. You held on to that box. You nearly drowned rather than let it go. That's not cowardice, Klaus. That's courage. Courage. Klaus laughed bitterly. I let Vance blackmail me for 2.5 years. I helped steal land from people who'd already lost everything. I stood by and watched Pike kill a child, and I did nothing. Where's the courage in that? The courage, Ruth said, is in trying to make it right, in giving me the gun and the water, in nearly dying to save those boundary maps and agency roles. You can't change what you've done, Klaus, but you can still choose what you do next. Klaus stared at her, and Ruth saw something shift in his expression, a kind of desperate hope struggling to break through the guilt and exhaustion. What do I do? He asked quietly. You help us finish this, Ruth said. You help us stop Vance and Pike. You help us find that strongbox and return the boundary maps and agency roles to the families they were stolen from. And then, she paused, choosing her words carefully. Then you face whatever consequences come. But at least you'll face them knowing you tried to do the right thing at the end. Klaus closed his eyes, and a single tear tracked down his weathered cheek. Then he nodded. All right, let's finish this. They found Vance and Pike's trail easily. The two men had been moving fast, leaving boot prints in the mud and disturbing the algae that grew on the tunnel walls. Mato led the way, moving with the easy confidence of a predator, tracking wounded prey. And Ruth followed close behind the derringer, back in her boot, and Klaus's hand firm on her shoulder to keep her steady as they navigated the treacherous footing. The tunnel opened suddenly into a larger space, and Ruth realized with a jolt that they'd reached the main shaft of the vertical passage that connected the mine's upper levels to the riverbed, far below. A makeshift ladder had been built against one wall, rungs lashed together with rope and wire, and Ruth could see daylight filtering down from above. They're heading for the trestle, Klaus said. Going to meet the buyer and try to salvage what they can without the strongbox. Without the boundary maps and agency roles, Whitlow asked. What are they going to sell? Klaus grimaced. Vance kept copies. Forgeries mostly, but good enough to fool a buyer who's never seen the originals. If he can get across that trestle and make the sale, he'll disappear with the money and leave Pike to take the blame. Then we stop them at the trestle, Ruth said. She started toward the ladder, but Mato caught her arm. Wait, look. He pointed up, and Ruth's heart sank. At the top of the shaft, barely visible in the fading light, she could see Pike's silhouette. He was waiting, rifle in hand, covering the exit. He'll pick us off the moment we start climbing, Whitlow said. Not if we give him something else to worry about, Mato said. He pulled the second knife from his belt and tested its balance. I can hit him from here. Maybe. Maybe. Klaus's voice was sharp. That's a 50-foot throw in bad light with a knife that's not weighted for throwing. You'll miss. Then we'll think of something else, Mato said. But Ruth could hear the frustration in his voice, the knowledge that they were trapped while Vance got away. And then Ruth remembered the gallery where Vance's men were. She said urgently, when we first saw them, there were supplies stacked against the wall, mining equipment, tools, explosives. I saw dynamite sticks wrapped in oilcloth. Klaus's eyes widened. You want to blow the shaft? No. I want to create a distraction. Make Pike think the mine's collapsing. He'll run and we can climb out while he's distracted. That's insane, Whitlow said. If you misjudge the blast, you'll bring the whole mountain down on us. Or we can sit here while Vance escapes, Ruth countered. Your choice, Doctor. Whitlow swore but nodded. All right, but I'm going with you. Klaus and Maddo, you stay here and be ready to climb the moment Pike bolts. They backtracked quickly, Ruth and Whitlow, moving as fast as they dared through the flooded tunnels. The water was higher now, lapping at Ruth's thighs, and the current had strengthened. She could feel it pulling at her legs, trying to drag her off balance. They reached the gallery, though, and found the supplies exactly where Ruth remembered. The dynamite sticks were wrapped in waxed canvas, the fuses long and trailing, and Ruth counted 5 sticks bundled together with twine. "This is too much," Whitlow said. 1 stick would be enough for a distraction. 5 could collapse the entire shaft. "That's the idea," Ruth said. She pulled the dynamite free and carried it back toward the main shaft, walking carefully to avoid jostling the sticks. Whitlow followed, his face pale but determined. When they reached Maddo and Klaus, Ruth held up the dynamite. "When I light this, you climb. Don't stop, don't look back, just climb." Klaus grabbed her shoulders. "Ruth, no, this is too dangerous. Let me do it." "You're exhausted and half drowned," Ruth said. "I'm faster. Trust me." She didn't wait for him to argue. She pulled a match from the tin Whitlow carried and struck it against the rough stone wall. The match flared bright and sudden, and Ruth touched it to the fuse. It caught with a hiss. Ruth ran, not toward the ladder, but away from it, deeper into the mine, drawing the lit dynamite with her. She heard Klaus shouting her name, heard Maddo curse, but she didn't stop. She counted in her head 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And when she reached 10, she threw the dynamite as hard as she could toward a side tunnel filled with rotting timber supports. Then she turned and sprinted back toward the main shaft. The explosion was everything and everywhere, all at once. The sound hit like a physical force, driving Ruth to her knees, and the pressure wave felt like hands shoving her from all sides. Dust and debris filled the air. And somewhere above, she heard Pike screaming, heard the ladder creak and groan under sudden stress. Ruth scrambled to her feet and ran the last 20 yards to the ladder. Klaus was already climbing, moving fast despite his exhaustion. Maddo went next, his movements fluid and economical. Whitlow gestured for Ruth to go ahead, and she grabbed the first rung and hauled herself up. The ladder swayed dangerously, some of the supports loosened by the blast, and when Ruth's hands slipped on the wet wood. Below her, the mine was collapsing. She could hear the timbers giving way, hear the crash of stone on stone, hear the water surging higher as passages filled and overflowed. She climbed faster, hand over hand, her arms burning with effort. Above her, Klaus reached the top and pulled himself out. Maddo followed, and then it was just Ruth and Whitlow on the ladder racing the collapse. Ruth's hand closed on the final rung, and Klaus leaned down and grabbed her wrist, holding her up and out into the night air. She collapsed on the ground, gasping, and Whitlow emerged a moment later, his rifle still clutched in one hand. They'd made it. Somehow, impossibly, they'd made it out alive. But there was no time to celebrate. Ruth pushed herself upright and looked around, taking stock. They were on the north bank of the dry riverbed, except it wasn't dry anymore. The flood from the mine had transformed it into a churning torrent, black and deadly in the darkness. And spanning the torrent like the skeleton of some ancient beast was the trestle. Pike was running toward it, rifle slung over his back, moving with the desperate speed of a man who knew death was close behind. And on the far side, barely visible in the moonlight, 3 horses waited. Ruth could just make out a figure standing beside them, the buyer, she presumed. And walking slowly, deliberately toward the center of the trestle was Silas Vance. He had something in his hand, a leather folder wrapped in oilcloth. The copies, the forgeries, proof enough to make the sale and disappear. "He's going to make it," Whitlow said. "We're too late." "No," Ruth said. She pulled the derringer. "I'm going after him." "Ruth, no," Klaus began. Yes. Ruth looked at him, and she felt calm for the first time all night. This has to end, Klaus. Here. Now. If Vance makes it across, we've lost. She started toward the trestle before anyone could stop her, the derringer heavy in her hand. Behind her, she heard Klaus swear and Mato shout, but she didn't look back. She stepped onto the first plank, felt it sag beneath her weight, and kept walking. The trestle was worse than she'd expected. Planks were missing, leaving gaps wide enough to fall through. The railings had rotted away in places, offering nothing to hold on to. The whole structure swayed with every step, groaning like something alive and in pain. Ruth kept moving one foot in front of the other, her focus narrowed to the planks ahead and the man in the center. Vance saw her coming and stopped, turning to face her. Even in the darkness, Ruth could see his smile. "Well, well," Vance called out. The sheriff's little wife playing hero. How touching. "Give me the folder, Vance. Or what, you'll shoot me." Vance laughed. "Go ahead, try. But you're standing on a bridge held together with prayers and bird droppings, and if you fire that gun, the recoil alone might send you straight into the river. Assuming the structure doesn't collapse first." Ruth raised the derringer. "I'll take that chance." Vance's smile faltered. He looked at her, really looked, and Ruth saw the moment he realized she wasn't bluffing. She would shoot him. She would risk the fall, the river, the collapse, because stopping him mattered more than her own survival. "You're insane," Vance said. "Maybe," Ruth agreed. "But I'm also done. Done with men like you who take and take and take and never care who you hurt. Done with being afraid. Done with letting you win." She pulled the trigger. The derringer's report was deafening. The recoil slammed Ruth's arm back, nearly causing her to lose her balance. But she caught herself on the railing, or what was left of it. The bullet missed Vance's head by inches, sparking off a metal brace behind him. Vance dove for cover, and the folder slipped from his hands. It tumbled through the air, pages scattering, and fell toward the water below. "No." Vance lunged for it, leaning far out over the railing, and the plank beneath him gave way with a sound like a breaking bone. Vance fell. He grabbed the edge of the trestle as he went down, fingers scrabbling for purchase. And for a moment he hung there, suspended between the structure and the river. His eyes found Ruth's, and in them she saw fear raw. Animal fear, the kind that strips away all pretense and leaves only desperate humanity. "Help me," Vance gasped. "Please, I'll tell you everything. Where the originals are hidden, who the buyers were, all of it. Just please." Ruth stood frozen, the derringer still smoking in her hand. Part of her wanted to help. Part of her remembered that Vance was a human being, flawed and desperate and terrified, just like everyone else. But she also remembered the families whose land he'd stolen. She remembered Mato's nephew shot while running. She remembered Klaus, hollow-eyed and broken by blackmail. And she remembered that some actions have consequences, and mercy to the cruel is cruelty to the innocent. Ruth didn't reach for Vance. She simply stood there and watched as his fingers slipped one by one from the wet wood. He fell without a sound, swallowed by the black water below. Ruth stood on the swaying trestle and felt nothing. Not triumph, not horror, not relief. Just a vast, echoing emptiness where fear used to live. Then the trestle began to collapse. It started slowly, one support giving way, then another, the structure folding in on itself with terrible inevitability. Ruth ran sprinting back toward the bank, her boots pounding on planks that disintegrated behind her like paper. She wasn't going to make it. The collapse was too fast, too complete, and Ruth felt the plank beneath her feet tilt and fall away. She threw herself forward, hands outstretched, and felt her fingers close on solid ground. Strong hands grabbed her wrists and hauled her up. "Mato. Klaus." both of them working together, pulling her to safety, even as the trestle fell into the river behind her, with a sound like the end of the world. Ruth collapsed on the bank, gasping, her whole body shaking. Klaus knelt beside her, checking her for injuries with hands that trembled. Matto sat on her other side, his good eye scanning the wreckage for any sign of Vance or Pike. There was none. The river had taken them both. "It's over," Whitlow said quietly. He was standing at the edge, staring at the wreckage. "It's finally over." But Ruth wasn't so sure. The strongbox was at the bottom of a flooded mine, the boundary maps and agency rolls lost or destroyed. Vance's copies had scattered in the wind. The buyer had fled when the trestle collapsed, and Ruth had no idea how they were going to prove any of what had happened or how they were going to return the stolen land to its rightful owners. "The originals," Ruth said, suddenly sitting up. "Klaus, you said Vance never told you where he kept them. But if anyone knows where they are, it would be the strongbox." Klaus finished. He looked at the mine entrance, then at the flooded riverbed. "We left it down there. We have to go back." "At dawn," Matto said firmly. "When we can see. When the water's settled." He looked at Ruth, expression fierce. "You did it, Ruth. You stopped them. That's enough for tonight." Ruth nodded slowly and leaned against Matto without meaning to. His arms settled around her shoulders, warm and steady, and they sat on the riverbank as the sky began to lighten in the east, painting the world in shades of gray and gold. Klaus sat apart from them, head-bowed, hands clasped between his knees. Whitlow cleaned his rifle and said nothing, lost in his own thoughts. And somewhere in the ruins of the trestle, carried by the current toward some unknown destination, Silas Vance's body floated face down in the black water, the stolen land boundary maps and agency rolls dissolving around him like dreams made of paper and ink. The federal marshal arrived 5 days later, a broad-shouldered man named Carter, who wore his badge with the weary authority of someone who'd seen too much and trusted too little. He listened to Ruth's story, read through her copied telegrams, examined the flooded mine and the ruined trestle, and interviewed Matto, Klaus, Whitlow, and Eliza. Then he sent 3 wires, one to the Army, one to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and one to the territorial governor, and waited for the bureaucracy to grind into motion. It took 18 months. In that time, Ruth and a team of miners Marshal Carter hired retrieved the strongbox from the flooded gallery. It was rusted and battered but intact. Inside were 43 land boundary maps and agency rolls, each one carefully documented and signed, each one representing a family that had trusted the treaty and believed the promises made by the government. Marshal Carter filed charges against every speculator and buyer whose name appeared in Vance's ledgers. Some fled the territory, others hired lawyers and fought back. But the boundary maps and agency rolls were legal, and the evidence was damning. And in the end, 37 of the 43 parcels were returned to their rightful owners. 6 families had died or disappeared, their claims forfeit, but 37 families got their land back. It wasn't justice, not complete justice, not the kind that erases harm, but it was something. It was a start. Klaus Erdmann stood trial for desertion and theft of military property. The Army confirmed his service record, confirmed the theft, and prepared to convene a court-martial. But Nathaniel Whitlow testified on Klaus's behalf, describing how the sheriff had helped stop the land theft at great personal risk. Eliza testified. Tom Briggs testified. Matto testified reluctantly but honestly about how Klaus had nearly drowned trying to save the strongbox. And Ruth testified. She told the court about the derringer and the flask, about Klaus's confession about his choice to help them at the end, even though he knew it would cost him everything. The court-martial took 2 weeks. In the end, Klaus was found guilty of desertion, but given credit for his cooperation in stopping a larger crime. His sentence was dishonorable discharge, and time served the 2.5 years he'd spent under Vance's control counted as a kind of unofficial punishment. He would never wear a badge again. He would carry the stain of desertion for the rest of his life. But he wouldn't hang. Klaus left Red Mesa the day after his sentencing. He packed his few belongings, signed the house over to Ruth as part of their divorce settlement. She'd filed the papers 6 months earlier, citing abandonment and irreconcilable differences, and rode east toward Denver without looking back. Ruth watched him go from the telegraph office window, and she felt a complicated mix of emotions she couldn't quite name. Sadness, yes. Relief, certainly. But also a kind of gratitude because Klaus had given her the tools to save herself, even if he couldn't save himself. And she felt hope, which surprised her most of all. Ruth and Matto were married in the spring of 1873, in a quiet ceremony attended by Eliza Whitlow, Tom Briggs, and Matto's family. Judge Halloran presided, the same judge who had married Ruth to Klaus, and if he thought anything about the bride's choice of groom, he kept it to himself. Eliza stood as Ruth's witness, wearing her best dress and a smile that was equal parts fierce and proud. Whitlow stood for Matto, and afterward he and Eliza walked together to the schoolhouse, talking in low voices about subjects Ruth wasn't privy to, but could guess at. 6 months later, Whitlow and Eliza were married too, in a slightly larger ceremony that half the town attended and the other half gossiped about. Ruth wore a dress she'd sewn herself, blue cotton with white lace at the collar, and Matto wore a vest his sister-in-law had embroidered with symbols that told the story of a man who'd lost everything and found something worth keeping. They spoke their vows in front of people who loved them, and afterward they walked to the cabin Matto had built on his family's land near the spring that ran clear and cold year-round. It wasn't much of a cabin. One room, a stone fireplace, a rope bed Matto had woven himself, but it was theirs. Ruth kept the telegraph office riding into town 3 days a week to handle messages and maintain the equipment. Matto worked the land with his nephew, planting corn and squash and teaching the boy the skills he would need to survive in a world that was changing faster than anyone could predict. Their daughter was born in the winter of 1874 in the cabin with Eliza attending as midwife, and Ruth gripping Matto's hand hard enough to leave bruises. They named her Clara after Ruth's mother, and she had Ruth's gray eyes and Matto's steady hands and a cry loud enough to wake the dead. Matto held his daughter and wept, and Ruth understood. He was crying for his nephew, for his brother, for all the children who hadn't survived to see this new world being built from the ruins of the old. He was crying because Clara represented hope, and hope was the rarest and most precious thing a man could hold. Their son came 2 years later in the summer of 1876, and they named him Klaus. Eliza protested. "Ruth, you don't have to." "I want to," Ruth said firmly. "Klaus made terrible choices. He did terrible things. But at the end, he tried to make it right. That deserves to be remembered. That deserves to be honored." So their son carried Klaus Erdmann's name, and when he was old enough to ask questions, Ruth told him the story. Not all of it. Some parts were too painful, some parts were private, but enough. She told him that names carried weight, and that weight could be a burden or a gift, depending on what you chose to do with it. She told him that justice wasn't a destination, but a journey, something you had to work for every single day. And she told him that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the choice to act anyway, to stand up and speak truth even when your voice shook and your hands trembled and every instinct screamed at you to run. Her children listened wide-eyed and asked if it was true. "Every word," Ruth said, and it was. 15 years after the events at the trestle, Ruth stood on the porch of the cabin and watched her children play near the spring. Clara was 19 now, tall and serious, teaching at the school Eliza had built. Klaus was 13, strong and quiet, helping Matto work the land and learning to track game in the canyons the way his father had learned from his father. Ruth was 43 years old, and her hair had started to turn silver at the temples, and her hands were calloused from work and scarred from old injuries that had never quite healed right. But she was healthy, and she was loved, and she was free in ways she'd never imagined possible when she was 22 and desperate and marrying a stranger to escape her father's debts. Maddo came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "You're thinking loud thoughts," he murmured. "I can hear them from inside." Ruth smiled and leaned back against him. "I was thinking about how far we've come, how much has changed. And how much hasn't," Maddo added. "Some of the townsfolk still won't talk to us. Still think you married beneath you and I married above me." "Let them think what they want," Ruth said. "We know the truth. That's enough." Maddo kissed her temple, a gesture so familiar and comfortable. It felt like breathing. "I found something yesterday, when I was repairing the fence near the old camp." He pulled something from his pocket and held it out, a brass button stamped with the insignia of the U.S. Army. It was tarnished and bent, but the markings were still clear. "It was buried near where my brother's lodge used to stand," Maddo said quietly. "Must have fallen off one of the soldiers' uniforms during the raid." Ruth took the button and turned it over in her hands. It was small and ordinary, the kind of thing that wouldn't matter to anyone except the people whose lives it represented. "Let's bury it," she said, "near the spring where your brother's box was hidden. Not to forget, but to remember. To mark that something terrible happened here and people died and it mattered." Maddo nodded slowly. "I'd like that." They walked to the spring together, hand in hand, and dug a small hole near the rock cairn that marked where the boundary maps and agency rolls had been buried. Ruth placed the button in the hole, and Maddo covered it with earth and stones. And they stood together in the fading light, and said nothing because some things didn't need words. Later that night, after the children were asleep, Ruth sat at the small table in the cabin and wrote in the journal she kept for her daughter. She'd started it when Clara was born, intending to pass it on when her daughter came of age, a record of everything Ruth had learned and hoped and feared. "Dear Clara, when you read this, I'll be old, or maybe gone, and you'll be the age I was when everything changed. I want you to know some things because the world will tell you lies about who you are and what you're capable of. And I want you to have the truth. Justice is not something that happens to you. It's something you make with your own hands and your own choices, even when it's hard and even when you're afraid. Love is not a lightning strike or a fairy tale. It's something you build piece by piece from trust and respect, and the willingness to stand beside someone when the world tries to tear you apart. Courage is not the absence of fear. It's the choice to act anyway, to fight for what matters, even when the odds are impossible, and the cost is everything. Your father and I built a life from ashes and flood water, and the stubborn refusal to let men like Vance and Pike win. We built it for you, and for your brother, and for every child who comes after. Don't waste it. Don't settle for safety when you could choose freedom. Don't stay silent when you could speak truth. And remember, you are not alone. You never have to fight alone. With all my love, your mother." Ruth set down the pen and closed the journal. Outside, a coyote called, and Maddo stirred in his sleep, reaching for her automatically, even in dreams. Ruth slipped back into bed beside him, and his arm curved around her waist, and she closed her eyes and let herself rest. The story was over. The life had just begun.